Es un honor que me incluyan en esta conferencia tan importante en este país y ciudad tan hermoso. Quería decirles que siento mucho que no hablar su idioma muy bien. Mis hijos que se criaron hablando perfectamente el español me han dicho muchas veces que por favor me limite a hablar en castellano. Que me limite a hablar en inglés. Así es un ejemplo. Por lo tanto, les pido disculpas por no hablar en español, pero mejor que yo sigo el consejo de mis hijos. Okay. So I'm going to address three questions. The first one is, are capital markets simply casinos where the rich from around the world come to place their bets? And the second is, does a country really need its own domestic capital markets? Or can savers and investors and firms simply use international financial centers, capital markets in other countries, along with their domestic banks to finance firms and get whatever services they're going to get from securities markets? And finally, what types of policies promote well-functioning capital markets? So first, are capital markets simply casinos? Here I want to raise a few conceptual issues, and then I'll present some evidence surrounding the answer to this question. So the big issue here is that capital markets can promote economic growth and welfare, and they can do so in a variety of ways. So first, capital markets can mobilize resources, can mobilize the savings of disparate individuals for immense works. And I take this terminology from Walter Bagot, who was writing in the 19th century about England. Now, the issue here is not that capital markets are going to increase the savings rate. We can have a bunch of individuals, say all of whom are saving 10%, each of whom has to invest it in his or her business or farm or small enterprise. That's not the issue. The issue is that capital markets can mobilize savings from many people and invest it in those activities that are going to yield the biggest returns. So it's not that capital markets are necessarily going to have a big impact on growth by increasing the savings rate. It's that capital markets, by mobilizing savings, can have a big impact on growth by investing it in those endeavors with the biggest returns. The other issue is that capital markets play a big role in deciding where to allocate society savings. So capital markets, individuals involved with searching out who has the best ideas, who has the most entrepreneurial energy, they can have an impact on who gets to use those resources, and that way can improve or worsen the quality of resource allocation. And once those resources are allocated, capital markets can play a role in ensuring that those funds are used in an appropriate manner. Or capital markets, if they don't function properly, can also influence whether those resources are misused and therefore don't promote growth. But one way or the other, this role has a huge effect on how a country develops. The other thing has to do with liquidity and risk management. So it's very common to talk about the positive role of risk diversification. And given the recent crisis in the world, it's very common to talk about the problem with the recent crisis in the world. It's very common to talk about the problems with liquidity. But we shouldn't forget that one of the huge issues, a huge problem that capital markets overcame and have helped overcome and continue to help overcome is the issue that many savers want to invest in high return projects, but savers sometimes need access to their money. Okay? My daughter recently got into Swarthmore, which is a very expensive private school, and that's good. But at the same time, her father had to pay for it, which means taking my savings out of certain investments in order to pay for college. Okay, so if there's a great investment and I want to invest in it with a high expected return, my ability to be able to turn that money into cash and pay for something great, like my daughter getting into Swarthmore, or turn it into cash in order to pay for something bad if somebody in my family were going to be sick is very important and very valuable. So with securities markets, with liquid securities markets, I can turn an investment in a very high return project into something liquid if those securities markets are indeed liquid. That service provided by capital markets, liquidity, can be very important for mobilizing resources for high return projects if it overcomes the reluctance of people to invest in projects that aren't very liquid. That liquidity transformation is important. Of course, since we're talking about concepts, and what makes this problem interesting is that there are two sides to this argument, and that I've just laid out some of the concepts for why capital markets can be good for growth. There are also a variety of arguments for why capital markets are not necessarily good for growth. Capital markets may indeed be simply casinos where the rich come to place their bets, and that these casinos have an adverse effect on the economy. So for example, capital markets might just be volatile, and that volatility may make investors nervous, and that may induce people to invest abroad, and this would reduce domestic capital formation and have an adverse effect on the promotion of human welfare in a particular economy. It also might be the case, many people have argued to me, that basically capital markets are simply going to fund some big firms, and in funding big firms, that's going to reduce the efficiency of resource allocation, it's going to cut down on competition, and it's going to slow economic growth. So what makes this question interesting from a research perspective is that it is indeed a debate about which very well-meaning people can have disagreements, and hence I'm going to present some evidence which I think will help arbitrate this debate. At least I hope it does. So the next thing has to do with what is the evidence about this question. So I'm going to present this in a series of graphs because I think they make the point, and we can criticize the graphs, but behind these graphs is a lot of econometric evidence, which I guess is something that most of you don't want to see, but which is available for those who do. So here we take a measure of stock market liquidity, where by stock market liquidity, I'm measuring this in a common way, which is how much trading goes on in the stock market relative to the size of the market. There are other measures of stock market liquidity in order to capture how much trading there is of the means of production in society. So rather than looking at trading relative to the size of the market, which is the graph here, we could look at trading relative to the size of the overall economy, and you'd get a very similar graph. And here I've simply divided the world, and because I'm starting in 1976, I only have data on, say, about 48 countries in many of these graphs when I'm looking at securities markets. We can divide the world up into those with the lowest level of stock market liquidity in 1976. We'll call those very illiquid. Those with the next most, so the next 12 would be illiquid, then liquid, and then very liquid, say putting 12 countries in each group. We can make this more complicated because there are a variety of countries where there are essentially no stock markets and they're ignored in this graph, but we can include them in the analysis, and that actually only strengthens the results. And then we're simply going to look in this graph about what happens to real per capita GDP growth over the next 12 years. So what you can see is that stock market liquidity, the degree to which there's a lot of trading of shares, and that's what I mentioned to you earlier, might be a service provided by securities markets, that I want to invest in something with a high expected return, but I want that flexibility of getting out if I need access to my cash. That's what this measure of liquidity is supposed to capture. You can see that this is very closely and positively associated with economic growth. If we don't want to look at overall economic growth, if we want to look at the manner in which stock markets are associated with growth, we can divide this up into the accumulation of capital and human capital, and we can divide it up into everything else, which we're going to call productivity growth. So here what is graphed is everything else, which economists often call productivity growth, and so it's everything about growth that can't be explained by the accumulation of capital and physical capital, and we'll call that productivity. And so here you see an even tighter link. So there's a very strong link between stock market liquidity and the growth rate of productivity. And this links up again with the concept that I mentioned earlier, that what stock markets are going to do is affect which types of investments are undertaken. They're going to improve the quality of investments that are undertaken. It's not very closely associated with savings. So it's not that capital markets, on the whole, in the average country across the world over this time period, are boosting the savings rate. What they're doing is they're boosting the quality of investment such that productivity growth is more rapid. There's a couple of other things that are valuable to point out, and that is that it's not the overall size of the market. So here there are some interesting countries. So for example, if you look at Chile, which is obviously a huge success story, they have a very large market in that many securities are listed on the exchange, but they don't have a very liquid market in that there's not a lot of trading that goes on. Now, conceptually, it's not the fact that one has a security listed on the exchange that's going to improve the quality of resource allocation. What's going to improve the quality of resource allocation is that the stock market provides some service, such as providing liquidity, not simply as having a stock listed on the exchange. Now, stock markets may provide other services besides liquidity, but liquidity is one that we can measure, and hence that's the one that I'm using here. Also, addressing one of the conceptual issues is maybe stock market volatility is bad for the economy. But that also turns out really not to be the case. There's not a very strong link between the volatility of a stock market and how the economy performs in the long run. So capital markets, from this evidence, the capital markets foster long-run growth by improving the allocation of capital, not by boosting the savings rate. They do so by providing particular services to the economy, not simply by having a bunch of stocks listed. So for example, the Korean government, as part of its growth strategy a couple of decades ago, basically gave a tax inducement for companies to list their shares on the stock exchange. Market capitalization rose, but it didn't do anything in terms of providing services to the economy, and there was not a subsequent boost in the rate of economic growth. And volatility is not too important. So again, as I mentioned, I'm not going to go into this, what about other things? This doesn't control for other differences in the country, but in a variety of statistical work and controlling for other things about the economy, whether it's open to trade, whether it's fiscal policy, whether it's monetary policy, whether it's the political system, whether it's various measures of corruption and institutional development, these results still hold. When one tries to control for causality, well, maybe it's just the case that successful economies develop stock markets. It's not that stock markets boost economic growth and foster a more successful economy. No, while it's certainly the case that economic growth might affect the development of financial markets, a lot of evidence suggests that improvements in financial markets exert a causal independent impact on economic growth. Okay, that's all well and good. But growth for whom? That still hasn't answered the question. It answers the question that maybe stock markets are not casinos. They tend to increase average real per capita GDP growth. They tend to do so by improving the efficiency of resource allocation. But perhaps it's just the rich that benefit, and that boosts average real per capita GDP growth. So what I want to do here is now look at the relationship between financial market development and income inequality and poverty per se. Okay. And this is something, this is something that might be the most important message, so I'll mention it here and I'll mention it again, is that what I'm going to argue, it's not an argument, what I'm going to point out a lot of evidence finds, it's that even people who will never issue a security, people who will never purchase a security, can benefit enormously from well-functioning capital markets. That if policymakers are simply worried about reducing unemployment and boosting the welfare of the lower income strata in a society, boosting securities markets is a very important part of a strategy to succeed in that dimension. Okay, so growth for whom? Now, what I have here, and this is because this is where the state of research is right now, is a measure of overall financial development and not a measure of capital markets or stock markets or bond markets per se. Okay, so I don't have a separate measure here for the liquidity of stock markets and how, or the liquidity of bond markets and how those might affect income inequality and poverty. Rather, I just have an overall measure of financial development. So that's an important qualification here. The other evidence has to do with very specific targeting of stock market liquidity. So what you see here with that qualification is that overall financial development has a strong negative relationship with changes in income inequality. Okay, now what you see is the red line is this relationship across the world over the period between 1980 and 2000, is that countries with better developed capital markets, better developed financial markets more broadly, have slower growth or reduction in income inequality. Okay? Now this holds after controlling for many other features, including overall economic growth. So this is the independent impact of finance on inequality after controlling for growth in political institutions and trade and everything that we could think of. You'll also point out, by the way, that the United States has much higher levels of inequality than would be predicted by its level of financial development, and that's kind of a source of concern in my particular country. Colombia, by the way, is within that cloud of letters that you can't read, which suggests that Colombia fits the regression line pretty well. So financial development, over and above all of the other things associated with growth, exerts a negative impact on income inequality. We can even target the poor. Okay, so when we say poor here, we're using a World Bank definition of people who live on less than $2 a day. So the issue I want to get across, and it's again this theme I'm going to come back to, is that people who are living on less than $2 a day are not issuing a bond. And people who are living on less than $2 a day are probably not buying a bond or a stock. But they do look for work in an economy, and the nature of that job search depends upon whether they're looking for work in a dynamic economy or a stagnant economy. And the level of the development of the financial system has a huge impact on whether that's an active, dynamic economy or a stagnant economy, and hence it has a huge impact on the lives of people who are never going to be involved in the formal financial system. So what you can see here, and this is only involved, so you don't see any of the richer countries in the world, because in the richer countries of the world, you just don't have any people really living on less than $2 a day. What you can see is that more financial development is associated with a reduction in the poverty rate, which is the percentage of the population living on less than $2 a day. And again, this is above and beyond the impact of financial development on growth. So what's being depicted here is not that finance boosts growth and growth helps the poor. We're controlling for that. Above and beyond any impact on finance and growth, which has an impact on the poor, finance has a disproportionately positive impact on the poor. Okay, and hence helps explain why there's a reduction in income inequality. Okay, so are capital markets simply casinos? No, they're not simply casinos. Financial systems are important for people who will never use the financial system, and they influence whether people are looking for work in this dynamic economy or in a more stagnant environment. Okay, so the next, does a country really need a domestic capital market, or can it rely on domestic banks and foreign markets? So here I first want to start out with a question, do we really need stock markets and bond markets? Now, can't banks kind of do all this, especially in lower income, middle income economies? Do they really need is a stock market? Or if they need a stock market, does every country need its own stock market? Or there's another issue, which is, are these two things, are they just substitutes? Basically, okay, we have securities markets, they're going to compete with banks, maybe a little competition is good, but they're basically providing the same service. So here, conceptually, it's not clear that they're providing the same service. Banks form long-term relationships. They tend to make loans for shorter periods of time. Bonds tend to be of a longer maturity, and stocks are for a much longer maturity. And markets also tend to allow people to customize what types of risks they want to take. So it's not clear that these things are substitutes. So I'll give you a little bit of evidence on this, and I'll stick to the simple graphs and kind of point you elsewhere if you want more econometrics. So here again, what I do is I start out in 1976. I start out in 1976 because this is when there started to be a systematic collection of data on stock markets. Bond markets, it's very difficult to compare across countries. So that's not involved, that hasn't been much involved in the, it's a big hole in the academic research to date. But here what you have is I've divided the world up into 4 different groups. So there are countries that have illiquid stock markets and low levels of bank development in 1976, and then all the other different categories, including those countries that had liquid stock markets in 1976 and well-developed banking systems in 1976. So you have these 4 categories. So what are you supposed to see from this graph, except for some nice colors? What I hope you'll see is that no matter where you start from, unless you start from high liquidity and highly developed banks, that an improvement in one, so an improvement in bank development or an improvement in stock market development, is associated with a higher rate of economic growth regardless of your level of the other component of the financial system. So regardless of what your level of stock market development is, an improvement in the banking system is associated with more rapid growth. Regardless of what your level of banking development is, an improvement in the stock market liquidity is associated with faster economic growth. Okay, so again, you can control for the level of economic development and all different sorts of macro policies and exchange rate policies and political indicators, and you still sort of find these results, and you can do things to try to control for issues of causality. But it seems to be the case, many different researchers looking at this in a variety of ways, not without exception, researchers like to argue, but the abundance of evidence suggests that each of these 2 components exerts a positive impact on economic growth. So it's not banks versus markets. It's banks and markets. Okay, the next thing is, does this relationship change as countries develop? So does Haiti really need its own stock market? Or basically, does it need a banking system that operates just a little bit? Okay, but then there are other questions, as perhaps as countries are developing, maybe stock markets become more important. Perhaps for Colombia now, stock market development is going to be a much more important component of its financial system than it has been over the last few decades. So this graph, and I know it's not as nice, it's not as colorful, and it's also not as easy to read, but it gives a particular story. Okay, so the part of the graph that might be hard to see, there's a yellow line that's sort of going up in both graphs, and that yellow jagged line going up in both graphs is showing that as you move from poorer to richer countries, and as you move from left to right across the graph, you're going from poorer to richer countries, stock market development tends to go up, and bank development tends to go up. On the left graph, that's a measure of banks, and on the right graph, you have a measure of stock markets. Now what the blue line is the blue line is an estimate of the impact on economic growth of an improvement in either bank development in the left graph or stock market development in the right graph. So the first thing that you should see in the blue line is that it's always positive. Okay, so improving banks or improving markets, like the graph that I showed earlier, is associated with more rapid economic growth. But the other thing that you should see in this graph is that the impact of bank development falls as countries become richer, and the impact of stock markets, capital markets, on growth becomes larger as countries develop. Capital markets become more important for future economic success as a country tends to become richer. Okay, this just graphs that, breaking the economies down into the 25th percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 75th percentiles to make things a little bit simpler. And so this makes the case, if you're Haiti, you don't have to worry about capital markets, and if you're Colombia, you do. Okay, so what about international capital markets? Okay, so there really is a local component to all financial markets, and there seems to be a lot of informational expertise that's important for and contained within a local community. And the other element is when you look at which firms issue securities in international markets, it's really only the very, very largest of firms. Okay? In domestic capital markets, it's true that in most capital markets, it's larger firms that issue securities, but they're not as large as the firms that have access to international financial centers. Okay, so here's some statistics from a recent paper that I've been working on with Sergio Schmuckler at the World Bank, and it makes this point. So if you look at the composition of issues at home that are $250 million or more, it's only about 22% of the sample of firms in the overall world capital markets. If you look at the composition of issues abroad in this large category of issues of $250 million or more, it's 36%. So this is just making this point that even when we include all of the capital markets in the world, it's the bigger firms that go abroad. Okay, so do you really need a domestic capital market, and can it rely on domestic and just the domestic banks and foreign securities markets? I think the answer here is twofold, as I've mentioned with the evidence, and that is capital markets provide services to the economy that are different from banks. And economies benefit from both services, and as economies become more developed, the costs to future economic development of not developing capital markets becomes larger and larger. If you link that up with the points earlier, this means that as economies move from middle-income countries and push forward and develop more, what this means is that even the policymaker who's not too interested in securities markets development, is not very familiar with all of that terminology, and is simply interested in helping with those in the lower end of the income distribution, those policymakers should become much more concerned about developing well-functioning financial markets. Okay, the importance of capital markets for economic activity grows. I mentioned that. And there are advantages to having a domestic capital market because it's only a very select number of firms who are going to get to go issue securities in New York or London or Japan or Frankfurt. Okay, so what type of policies promote well-functioning capital markets? Okay, so here it's kind of important. I thought I would just take a step back. I have about 18 minutes. And I'll present some graphs to put Latin America in some perspective because I think this motivates why it's very important for Latin America in general and Colombia in particular to take very energetic action to improve the functioning of capital markets. Okay, so first, Latin American bond markets are comparatively small when you look around the world, even when you compare those markets to countries maybe or areas of the world with potentially similar areas of economic development. Okay? So this is just sort of the overall size of the domestic bond market. Africa, it's not very fair because that's just South Africa. But if you compare it to East Asia, for example, Latin America doesn't compare very favorably. This becomes even starker if we only look at the private bond market. Okay, so if we get rid of all issues of bonds by the public sector, this becomes a bigger deal and perhaps draws more urgency toward supervisory, regulatory, and policy reforms that remove impediments to the development of well-functioning capital markets. It's also the case, and this is not surprising perhaps given the distribution of income in many countries in Latin America, that is the issuance is very, very concentrated. So if we look at the percentage of capital raised by the top 5 issues, this is very concentrated. And by very concentrated, I mean very concentrated in a comparative sense to other areas of the world. Okay. Equity markets are also not particularly large and well developed. And primary markets are also limited when we look at equity markets issuances. So this is how much capital is raised through the issuance of stocks. Okay? Again, Latin America, given its overall level of economic development, not particularly well developed. So again, if I go back to this whole theme, if we take a large body of research as given, securities markets, capital markets become much more important for future economic development as economies develop. When you look at Latin America, which is comparatively well developed relative to some of the other areas of the world, the underdevelopment of its capital markets might become a particularly limiting constraint on future economic progress. Okay, and this is just the same theme about the concentration of issues in these particular markets in terms of access. Okay, so now I'll turn more directly to policies. So here, all countries are special, and all countries are special, and there are differences, at the legal level, and at the cultural level, and at the political level, tax level. And so I definitely don't want to talk about Colombia in particular, but there are some overall messages that emerge from a variety of cross-country studies that I thought I would put out there. So first of all, there's always this challenge that in order for capital markets to function well, one needs supervisory and regulatory and legal system that is powerful enough and independent enough to make markets transparent, to force financial institutions to behave with integrity, and to break down barriers to competition. I'll mention that again, break down barriers to competition. Okay? In talking to people yesterday, there are lots of barriers in Colombia, the United States, around the world, that many entities looking to protect themselves construct barriers to competition. And a large role that regulatory and supervisory agencies should play is breaking down those barriers in order to foster competition. Too often, regulatory and supervisory agencies are the tools that are used to create barriers to competition. Okay? So what I'm saying here is that we need regulatory and supervisory agencies powerful enough to break down barriers to competition, force integrity and transparency. But at the same time, we need to have mechanisms in place that ensure that the supervisory agencies are using that power in a manner that supports well-functioning markets, and they're not using that power in a manner that simply protects particular interests. Okay, so then the broad categories kind of come back: transparency, integrity, and competition, and to avoid directive hands-on regulation and supervision. So a huge body of evidence, again and again, suggests that it's allowing competition and transparency. Transparency is a mechanism for fostering competition. Integrity is a mechanism for making people confident about using the market, so it allows it to flourish and allows a broader array of people to feel comfortable participating in the market. And again, it's a very hands-on approach by regulators that can have an adverse effect. So you probably want more specifics, and I'm probably not going to give you sufficient specifics. But here there's an evidence about shareholder rights. So around the world, there's a huge amount of research which suggests that laws that empower shareholders in order to enforce their rights on firms, and a legal system that provides the mechanisms for shareholders to implement at least the de facto power, make it a real, the de jure power, make it a de facto power. This is absolutely crucial, along with information disclosure. Okay, private credit bureaus that allow more information are another mechanism. Okay, so in conclusion, capital markets are not simply casinos. They can play a very powerful role in fostering economic development. They can play a very powerful role in creating an environment in which it's those people with the best ideas, those people with the most entrepreneurial energy that have access to capital. And I would rephrase that. We could say by having access to capital, a well-functioning financial system makes it possible for those people with the best ideas and those people with the most entrepreneurial energy, they have the opportunity, because in this sense, capital is the opportunity to realize those aspirations. And on the other hand, if it's not a well-functioning capital market, it's much more likely that capital is going to be allocated not to those with the best ideas and entrepreneurial energy, but it's much more likely that capital is going to be allocated to those with the most political connections and the most parents with the most accumulated wealth. Markets and banks are important for growth, and developing domestic capital markets seems to be important in most contexts to the best of our ability to do the best of research's finding so far. And Latin America and Colombia, which fits very much sort of the middle of the distribution of Latin America on the whole, does not have very well developed capital markets. And this should really be a priority for policymakers looking to enhance economic welfare. So, thank you very much.
Dr. Levine, if you could please provide a little bit more color on the, let's say, beneficial effects of having capital markets, or that capital markets bring to economic development and economic growth than the traditional forms of financing of an economy.
So I think that the main differences between capital markets and banks might fall along the following lines. So one is the duration associated with the provision of capital to a firm. So banks oftentimes lend for a fairly short period. Bond markets can lend for a much longer period. Stock markets, it's essentially permanent. So if we go back to the original point that I made about liquidity, stock markets and bond markets can provide long-term liquidity. So, the traditional argument here is you're going to build if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, if you're going to build a railroad, and maybe we know with 100% certainty, so for this example, let's get rid of all of the other types of risk. We know that this railroad is going to pay off double what you invest in 20 years. And that's great. So most of us would like to double our money in real terms. Let's say it's going to be 100% return per year, but you can only get this return in 20 years. So a bank has a difficult time with this because it'll keep rolling over the loan. So there's some uncertainty about whether it'll be rolled over, and so the firm faces that uncertainty. If you can issue a bond, or if the railroad can sell stock, then I might be willing to make this investment hoping that I'm going to get this huge return in 20 years. And then if my kid gets into college or my parents get sick and I need access to my wealth, I can turn that into cash, sell it to somebody else who wants to pick up that big return in the future. So by facilitating this long-term liquidity, capital markets can play a huge role. The other thing is that banks provide standardized services where securities markets, capital markets typically allow for the possibility of much more customization. So customization of the types of securities that firms issue, but also customization in terms of the types of financial instruments that firms or individuals want to use in order to hedge risks. And so all of these are different from what banks tend to provide. And the other thing is that capital markets aggregate the information that many individuals can accumulate by assessing firms. So banks have an advantage. You have lots of people working in banks. They're experts in assessing what's going on in a firm. And that's beneficial. At capital markets, you can have thousands of people. You can have hundreds of thousands of people. And if you have a large enough market, you can have millions and millions of people who through their interactions with the market and the things that they read will also have an impact on the price, and hence all of that information will be aggregated and related in a price that will impact the efficiency of resource allocation. So there might be some competition, obviously, between capital markets and banks. There's certainly overlap in the functions that are provided, but in terms of liquidity, in terms of information aggregation, there are differences. Another example, it has to do with the governance of a firm. So if you think about the monitoring of a firm, banks oftentimes sit on the boards of firms for which they have large loans, and they can exert governance in that way. But if they have a large loan out to a firm and the firm gets into trouble, there's nothing that requires the bank to release that information to the public. In capital markets, the immediacy of an assessment that the firm is not using investors' money well can be reflected very quickly in prices. Now, in terms of the financial crisis, that's not always a positive thing, but in terms of the governance of firms, it means that there's a very, oftentimes can be a very immediate impact on the market's assessment of how a firm is doing and whether it's investing the funds that it acquired from the public wisely.
Aquí adelante, otra pregunta.
Yes, Professor, you speak of promoting competition as a goal. Don't you think that regulators worldwide are moving against that concept and are stifling competition?
So I'm not. I think that regulators around the world are. I'm not sure if they're. I think regulators around the world have taken a lot of steps that have given a huge advantage to the very largest firms, and in that way, it's done two bad things. One is it's hurt competition, and I think the other, it's given. I think it's communicated a sense that many financial institutions are not only too big to fail, which is the common term, but too big to discipline. And I think you've seen that, for example, in the prices of equities in the US, where there's been a huge premium on the big banks and a huge discount on the small banks. And I think that some of those same things might be going on for securities firms as well. So yes, I think it's been, I think that the US as a leader in the type of regulatory changes that took place had the opportunity to make many positive reforms and instead gone in the opposite direction and made many reforms that I think will probably slow economic development in many countries, including the US, and hurt the efficiency of resource allocation and limit access to finance. So I think they're going in the wrong way, not the right way. But that's not a recommendation for Colombia to follow that, but hopefully an opportunity to distinguish itself in the eyes of international investors.
¿Alguna otra? Aquí adelante.
I have a question is, how does I have a question here, and it's how does short-term market expectations affect decision-making and value creation at a company level?
So if I understand correctly, so the question would be that if executives of firms are compensated by short-term movements in capital markets, then is it possible that developing capital markets would lead to a greater reliance in terms of compensating executives based on these short-term metrics, and might that be problematic? Is that the essence?
By the market.
Yes. Okay. So I'll repeat it again. Yes. So no, this is. I think you're bringing up an important problem associated with. I wouldn't call this a problem with capital markets. I'd call this with a problem of how managers of firms might be evaluated. So if managers of firms are evaluated based on monthly evaluations, then this can lead those managers to make investments that are not in the best interests of the firm in the long run, and hence not in the best interest of economic development in the long run. But there is evidence that this definitely happens. But the evidence still suggests that while there might be some adverse implications from having capital markets which facilitates this type of activity, that the positives far outweigh these associated negatives. And the hope is that these negatives, and this is what's reflected in the data, are relatively minor, and that smart investors will choose firms that don't follow these short-run gimmicks and instead invest in firms that are looking to maximize profits in the long run. But what you're bringing up is a very valid point.
Aquí, ahí atrás hay una pregunta.
Okay. At the end of your presentation, you said something about changing regulation. Could you go more in depth into that and explain us what you are actually thinking about Colombia or in terms of the market regulation to make it enhance growth and economy development?
So, I'm going to pass this on to you. No, you're good. So, I think I'm going to get myself into, I think anybody would get him or herself into trouble by talking about something that I don't know much about. So I am not an expert on Colombia, and so I don't want to talk about the details. Sebastián is much more knowledgeable, so I'm going to allow him to talk about, after his presentation, you can ask him about the details of Colombia. I think there's been a lot of work on securities markets in general. And so that's why I come back to things like how powerful are shareholders in terms of their ability to exert their influence on a company's leaders. I think that a bunch of research by Laporte, Lopez de Silana, Schleifer, and Vishny has, and many people that have examined and re-examined this have again and again found that this is extremely important, that the shareholders have influence over the executives, and that along with transparency. Some of the conversations that I've had since arriving in Colombia also suggest that there can be various rules and regulations that always emerge given various, how integrated policies that affect capital markets are that might limit the ability of competition in the market. And so I'm going to leave it vague and apologize.
Aquí adelante tenemos otra pregunta.
Thank you. Professor Levine, thanks for your dissertation. I would like to ask you, as you mentioned during your presentation, that many Latin American countries still have stock markets that are not trading enough stocks in this way. They're trading more bonds than other kind of things. In your opinion, what are the steps that we need to follow and need to take in order to improve the trading in the stock markets here in Latin America? Thanks.
So, these questions are an excellent introduction to what Sebastián's going to talk about, but I think that here, and this is based more on my experience in Chile, because I used to work at the central bank there for a while, and when I worked at the World Bank and we would go to countries and talk to officials, that the issue is the details. That in my experience, it's very easy in a fairly short period of time to identify various types of tax, legal, regulatory impediments that limit competition, and that's the main thing. And that there are also easy steps towards forcing transparency, and which is also a key toward creating a more competitive environment. And I think that a quick look at a legal system and the enforcement of those laws almost always brings up glaring problems in the ability of shareholders or investors, either in terms of the explicit definition of their rights, or in terms more accurately, it's almost always in the ability legally to enforce those rights at a low cost. So I can't say with 100% certainty that that's the case in Colombia, but I can say with 100% certainty that in the many countries I've worked on, it doesn't take very long to quickly identify glaring problems.
Professor Levine, thank you very much for your presentation.